Here's what I've come to understand through this work of racial equity. Racism doesn't disappear. And it reminds me of one of my past students who is South African who told me, Annie, apartheid is no longer in the constitution, but racism is still in the culture. And that's the thing with racism. It adapts, it learns, it moves from overt to covert, from violent to systemic, from being explicit to, and this is the phrase that I keep coming back to, it moves to being performed. Racism has learned to perform progress. And performed progress is still a form of obstruction because it gives people permission to stop looking. It says, hey, see how far we've come? And in that, looking back, we stop seeing what's still right in front of us. We are represented. We are represented. We are represented. Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started. From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found your way to this episode. My name is Annie Gishu, and this is the Represented Podcast, a space for values-led online business owners who are doing the work of inclusion. I teach this work through quite a unique lens of truth-telling and calling in rather than calling out. I feel so passionate about this work being held in a way that allows more people to come into it without feeling defensive, without feeling guilt or shame. A place where a sense of safety is felt so that you can move through this journey in a lasting way instead of just for a short period of time. Today's episode is one that is really close to my heart for reasons that will become quite clear very shortly. We're talking about the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which falls every year on the 21st of March. This episode is coming to you on Monday the 23rd, so a couple of days later. And in saying that, did you notice the day? Did it land for you, or did it move through the week like any other awareness date present on your calendar? Either way, this conversation is still worth having because what I want to explore today is something that goes beyond marking a date. I want to talk about what progress in this space actually looks like and how we know when it's real. Because some of what we've been calling progress is something else entirely. And that matters big time for those of us who are building businesses with inclusion at the very center of it. Now, the reason this day is close to my heart, the 21st of March happens to be my birthday, the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And for a long time, that was to me just a birthday. I grew up in Kenya, and I was aware that there was this day that existed, that the United Nations marked certain dates for certain reasons. But this particular day didn't really impact me directly because, to be quite honest, racism in the specific shape that this day was created to address, the violence of apartheid South Africa, the systems of racial control that led to the massacre this day commemorates, that wasn't my lived reality in Nairobi. I knew about racism well, especially because Kenya had been a British colony, and colonialism was a story I knew well from my parents, my grandparents, and my elders. But racism wasn't something I was navigating in my body, in my movement, in my day-to-day interactions at all. So the day existed, and my birthday existed. And for a long time, those two didn't really speak to each other. It wasn't until moving to Australia for my tertiary studies and many, many years later entering into the work of racial equity that I started to pay attention to this day with more presence. The day became more than just a day of commemoration because the history behind it started to feel rather personal. My birthday started to feel way bigger than just a day for me to celebrate. And I'll be honest with you, it's taken me a while to know what to do with that because there's so much significance to the date. And I know for a fact it's not just coincidence or happenstance. I think it's very much purpose and calling led, which I hold with a lot of honor and humility. I often think about the way proximity changes things, how a fact can sit in your awareness for years, and then one day it moves from your head to somewhere so much deeper. That's what this work did for me with this day. And I wonder if you have had a version of that experience too, where something you knew intellectually became something you felt deeply in your body. That's really what today's episode is about. If you've known me for any amount of time, you know my way of holding this work is not about constant correction. In fact, I cringe when I think about the constant correction surrounded by this work. And that is because I truly believe the most effective way to move through this work is by nurturing people into it, particularly those who feel it very personally, whether you are white, black, brown, indigenous, or a person of color. This work of bringing people along needs to be held tenderly. I personally feel like you need to leave room for mistakes that turn into lessons and not just pure cancel culture. I think about something the late US Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RBG, once said that if you are passionate about something, do it in a way that allows others to come along on the journey. That is the energy I want to bring to this work. And at the core of it all, what I want to do is point us toward our highest selves, to ask the questions that open something rather than close it down. You know, I'll say something I wasn't planning on saying, but as I share what's in my heart, I feel led to say that hate got us to where we are today, but it's love that will get us out of this and to where we are meant to go together equitably. So that's where we're going today. And to get there, I want to start at the beginning with where this day actually came from and why it exists. So allow me to take you back to South Africa, March 21st, 1960. At the time, South Africa was operating under a system that you may already know called apartheid, a legally enforced system of racial segregation that controlled almost every aspect of Black South African life. Where you could live, where you could work, where you could literally go. And one of the instruments of that control was something called the pass laws, a system that required Black South Africans to carry documents at all times that permitted them to be in certain areas. And without those documents, you can imagine what would happen. You could be arrested, you could be removed, you could be erased from a space simply because you existed in it without the right paperwork. On the 21st of March, 1960, a group of people gathered in a township called Sharpeville to peacefully protest those laws. They were not armed. They were not rioting. They were standing together and saying, this is wrong and we want it to stop. And then police opened fire. Reports from the United Nations tells us that 69 people were killed, and that includes children as well. Other reports have cited that 180 were injured. Many of them were shot in the back, which tells you something about the nature of the threat that was apparently being posed. Now, I want to pause on that for a moment before we move on, because I think it's really important that we don't just receive this as a historical fact and file it away. These were people who simply asked to move freely. That was the sum total of their demand, and they were killed for it. 6 years later, in 1966, the United Nations proclaimed 21st of March the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, a day of reckoning, a day of unity internationally saying, we will not look away from what happened here, and we will not pretend that the conditions that made it possible don't still exist in various forms around the world. That is the day. That is what it was born from. Now, here in Australia, the 21st of March is also known as something else. It's called Harmony Day. And I want to be really careful about how I hold this, because I'm not interested in pointing fingers or making anyone feel attacked. Harmony is genuinely a beautiful thing, and it's a beautiful aspiration. Nobody's against harmony. I'm not against harmony. But I think it's worth asking what happens to a day when we rename it. What does calling it Harmony Day do with the history I just shared with you? What, most importantly, I just want you to think on this. What does it allow us to skip over? And this also connects to something broader that I want us to hold throughout this episode. The role that language plays. There's a pattern, and I see it in institutions, governments, in corporates, where particular words get softened or replaced. Racism becomes social cohesion. Discrimination becomes division. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that softening is doing the work of making people feel comfortable rather than the work of moving people toward the truth. I want to be nuanced here because I genuinely believe this isn't a black and white matter. Making language more accessible, more palatable can be a real and valid strategy for bringing people into a conversation. And this is something that I had a conversation inside my membership called Ally, and we were talking about this last week. And it was very much centered around the fact that language is powerful and we can use it in very we can use it intelligently to put a certain agenda across, whether positively or negatively. And I'm not against it being palatable, so long as it leads us to the truth. So when I think of Harmony Day, it opens a door that gets someone curious enough to ask what's actually behind it. If it becomes an entry point into the real history, then it has served something useful. Language that lowers defensiveness so that truth can eventually land is not the same as language that replaces truth altogether. The question I find myself sitting with is this: is this language a door or is it a destination? Is it pointing us towards something real, toward truth telling, toward accountability or genuine change? Or is it allowing us to feel like we've arrived somewhere we haven't actually been yet and just to be comfortable? You see, that's a question I want you to sit with as we keep going, because it becomes very relevant very quickly. So, 66 years on from Sharpeville, 60 years on from the day being proclaimed, and here we are still marking it. I think some people, and maybe you've had this thought or had somebody say it, it's 2026. We have come so far. Why are we still talking about this? And I want to respond to this question carefully because it comes from a real place. People are genuinely tired. The news is relentless. We know that. The problems feel enormous. And there is genuine progress that has happened for sure. Like, for example, apartheid was dismantled. Legal frameworks exist. The conversation about inclusion has reached places it never used to reach. But here's what I've come to understand through this work of racial equity. Racism doesn't disappear. And it reminds me of one of my past students who is South African, who told me, Annie, apartheid is no longer in the Constitution, but racism is still in the culture. And that's the thing with racism. It adapts, it learns, it moves from overt to covert, from violent to systemic, from being explicit to, and this is the phrase that I keep coming back to, it moves to being performed. Racism has learned to perform progress. And performed progress is still a form of obstruction because it gives people permission to stop looking. It says, hey, see how far we've come? And in that, looking back, we stop seeing what's still right in front of us. Let me show you what I mean. The first thing I want to point to is something that happened right here in Australia just a few years ago in 2023. There was a referendum, and the question put to Australians was essentially this: should we change the constitution to recognize First Nations people and establish a body, a voice that could make representations to Parliament on matters affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? Just a voice. The ability to be heard on matters that directly affect your own life and community. We know how that went. It was rejected. More than 60% of Australians voted no. And what's really important to understand, because it's easy to hear 60% voted no and think, well, most Australians just don't care about First Nations people, but that's not quite what the data tells us. Surveys conducted immediately after the referendum, some from the Australian National University, ANU, found that nearly 9 in 10 Australians, and this includes around 3/4 of the people who voted no, said they believe First Nations people should have a say in matters that affect them. So the majority of Australians, including most of the people who voted against the voice, said that they believed in the very thing the voice was asking for. I think it reveals something really important about how systemic racism actually operates. It doesn't always look like hatred. It doesn't always feel like malice. It can operate through inherited structures, through disinformation that gets amplified in ways that are very hard to counter, through the discomfort of change being dressed up in the language of fairness. We don't want division. We want unity. We want harmony. That language again. And the data underneath, the day-to-day reality, is quite sobering, because according to Reconciliation Australia, First Nations people's experiences of racism from those who were surveyed increased from 39% in 2014 to 54% in 2024. The Closing the Gap targets the commitments made to address the very real inequalities in health, education, life expectancy between First Nations and non-Indigenous Australians remain largely unmet. The framework of reconciliation exists. The language of reconciliation exists. And the gap, it still persists. The signage of progress was erected, but the harm continues. Now, let me take you somewhere else. Let's go globally this time. And I want to talk about what happened in the corporate world after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. If you were running a business or paying attention to what was happening in organizations at the time, you'll remember the moment. It felt like a reckoning. Companies that had never publicly spoken about race suddenly had statements on their websites. Diversity, equity, and inclusion roles, they were being created at a pace that had never been seen before. In the United States alone, DEI roles more than doubled between 2018 and early 2023. Millions of dollars were pledged, commitments were made, and they were made in a public way. But then things changed. Legal challenges, political pressure, a backlash that built momentum through 2023 and accelerated through 2024 and into 2025. And one by one, many of these same organizations, Target, Boeing, Meta, Walmart, and many others, began dismantling the very teams they had built more than 2,600 DEI-related roles were eliminated in the US alone. Some companies rebranded their work as belonging or cultural transformation, and some just went silent, and some issued no statement at all. They just stopped doing the work. The commitments lasted exactly as long as the scrutiny did. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who made those commitments was being cynical. I don't think that's true or fair. I think some people genuinely wanted to do better and didn't have the internal architecture to hold that commitment when it became costly, which is actually a really important insight because intention without the structure doesn't survive the intense pressure it's put under. But I also think we have to name what this pattern reveals. When inclusion work is performed, when it lives in the press release and the job title and the statement on the website, it really cannot survive a change in the political weather because it was never done correctly. It wasn't embedded, and it was just a dress up. It was a costume that was put on. And this is where it comes back to language again. Some of those companies, rather than abandon the work entirely, rebranded it. We're not doing DEI anymore, we're doing belonging. And here's where I want to ask the same question I asked about Harmony Day. Is that language a door or a destination? Is belonging being used to bring people more toward the real work? Or is it being used to make the real work disappear while looking like it's still happening? The answer, I believe, varies. And that's actually my point. The word itself is not the problem or the solution. The question is always what it's pointing toward. Now, here is what all three of these things have in common: apartheid and the past laws, the voice referendum, the corporate DEI rollbacks. In each case, a structure existed that was causing harm. In each case, something that looked like progress was erected around it, statements, frameworks, new names, international days, and in each case, the people most harmed by the original structure continued to be harmed because the structure itself remained largely intact. That is what performed progress looks like. Performed racism. And this is why 66 years on from Sharpeville, we still need this day. Why do we need this day? So that we can keep looking and asking whether what we're calling progress is the progress that actually brings about positive change, the intended change. So I want to come back to the question I raised at the start. It's 2026. Haven't we come far enough? Why are we still talking about this? And here's my honest response. In November 2024, Australia launched its first ever National Anti-Racism Framework, the most comprehensive plan the country has ever produced for addressing racism across different systems, so legal, health, education, workplaces, media. 63 recommendations, a whole of society approach, and it was launched in 2024. Not 1999 when I believe Harmony Day was first celebrated. not 1966, 2024. That document exists because the work is not done, period. This is why the role of truth-telling is so central, because it allows us to see the actual journey and the next step required, so we can stop wondering why in 2026 or a time in the future we are still talking about eliminating racial discrimination. And just to be clear, the absence of overt violence is not the presence of justice. The existence of a framework is not the same as a framework working. And the moment institutions, governments, corporates are given permission to stop, many of them do. We've just watched that happen in real time. So the day still matters. And so much so as a refusal to let the looking away become a permanent thing for us. A date on the calendar that says, however uncomfortable this is, we are not done yet. And that brings me back to you, dear listener. You're not an organization. You cannot issue a public statement on your commitment to inclusion and then dissolve it when the political weather changes. You cannot rebrand your values as something more palatable when they become inconvenient. You came to this work because something in you recognized that it mattered. What the last few years have shown us in the corporate world, in our geopolitical landscape, in the rollback of so many of the commitments that were made so boldly, is that inclusion work, which lives only at the surface, cannot survive pressure. It was always going to come off when things got hard because it was dressed up. It was not embedded. But you are here. You're still asking questions. You're still sitting with the discomfort instead of walking away from it. And that tells me something about where your inclusion values actually live, how you make decisions, in who you hire and who you pay and whose work you share and whose voice you amplify, in the questions you ask yourself when no one is watching. That is embedded inclusion. And it is the only kind that holds. Doing this work in an embedded way, letting it actually change how you operate rather than just how you present. It's not easy. There's a requirement to keep looking when looking is uncomfortable, to keep questioning your own assumptions, your own unconscious biases, the stories you've inherited about who belongs and who doesn't, about what fairness looks like, and about whose voice counts. What I've witnessed over years and years of supporting clients and students is this. You have to do the identity work to examine who you are becoming as you do this work, because that is ultimately your leadership posture, which stems from the internal work that informs every decision you make. The 21st of March just passed, my birthday and the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Every year on this day, I find myself sitting, reflecting, and the feeling I come back to is gratitude. Gratitude for the clarity, for the fact that every year on my birthday, I get to ask myself, am I doing this work in a way that honors the people who came before? Am I pointing towards something real? Am I bringing people along on the journey in a way that makes them want to stay in this work? Those are the questions I'm sitting with this week. And I want to leave them with you too, as an invitation to your highest self, because that's really what this day is. Underneath the frameworks and the data and the politics and the corporate statements, the rebranding underneath it all, It's an invitation to keep looking, to keep asking, to refuse to let performed progress dictate our future. Now, if you're looking for a community where you can do this work with me guiding you along, that's what my program Represented exists for. I built it for you, for the business owner who isn't looking for a checklist or a certificate, who is looking for the structure and the community and the honest internal work that actually embeds these values, so that when the pressure comes, and we know it will come, there is actually something real underneath to hold. If you've been thinking about working with me, I want you to know that the waitlist for the next intake is open. And you can find those details at anigishuru.com/represented. I want you to have a look at that page. Come and find out if it's the right next step for you.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented.